Hauger History Podcast. This is episode 90. We're talking about the Roaring 20s, reviewing for a unit test before we move on to the Great Depression and World War II. Don't forget to follow this show on Twitter at Hauger History and subscribe on iTunes or YouTube on the Danny Hauger channel and the Hauger History playlist. Welcome into the episode. I'm going to dive right in because I know you are all eager to get on with other studies in other areas. And if you have a question or would like an episode covered, submit it in the comments section below. So in the 1920s, it's when I feel like America becomes modernized, like the world we know now. Less than 100 years of difference between then and now. And a popular dance in the 1920s that we demonstrated in class was the Charleston, that rock back, rock forward, and that was considered to be a lot of fun and new at the time. We did it in class and hope you enjoyed that. The preoccupation, though, that becomes very American and very capitalist friendly, acquiring physical goods, buying the newest and finest, and personally owning property that drives our market today, that's known as consumerism. Spending and purchasing and buying and owning and becoming the person that you want to with those possessions. The president that was in charge during this early period of the 20s was Warren G. Harding. He wanted a return to normalcy with lower taxes and higher tariffs. This push for new products, consumerism, and lifestyle improvements in the 1920s created a spike in consumer debt. Again, isn't it so modern to be borrowing to get all the things we want to keep up and compete with the Joneses? And one of the things that we all seem to want at this time period was the automobile. Henry Ford pioneered assembly line production in automobiles. He changed it from being days to complete a vehicle to 90 minutes. And during the 1920s, automobiles replaced railroads as the primary driver of economic growth. All the ingredients, the labor, the components, the production, the sales, and the exports became symbolic of the American economy. And at the same day that I'm recording this, November 26th, 2018, General Motors announced it's going to be closing 3 assembly plants by the end of 2019, affecting 5,600 jobs, mainly in Detroit and in other plants. And that's going to greatly change the automobile. Once again, someone will be recording their history podcast and talk about this day. But with assembly line production, the time to produce cars went down, and the total cost to purchase the car went down. So people could afford them more easily, and Henry Ford paid people above what was the minimum wage at the time, saying that I want my workers to be able to afford my products. During the 1920s, when automobiles replaced railroads, which of the following was not a way that women experienced more freedom? It's true, they were able to drive now, so were men. They were able to vote for the first time, and they had greater employment numbers, but the wages were not, and still in many cases are not equal. So, a woman in the 1920s expressing social freedom through fashion, parties, dance, and stylish clothing was known as a flapper. And that was something that we discussed in detail in my classroom. And how would you feel as a parent if your child was rebelling against the traditional norms and experiencing this new freedom? We compared it to modern day with the way music always seems to be pushing boundaries and pop culture and movies. And are things really changing that rapidly? So that was an interesting discussion that you might have if you're at a different school and that you might suggest. So a woman in the 1920s, we've discussed how they were experiencing more freedom in some cases, and which act made it a federal crime to transport and sell alcohol during this era. That's the Volstead Act. So alcohol consumers didn't stop drinking. They stopped publicly drinking, and they often went underground and frequented speakeasies, places where they could order, consume, imbibe, and enjoy company without the worry of the police or other lawmakers getting involved. And people continued to transport alcohol, became very profitable during Prohibition. They tried to circumvent the ban of alcohol. They were known as bootleggers, often carrying alcohol in any place that they could, and sometimes that would be in a deep boot or in any kind of bag or even moonshine from a tub. So there were lots of ways in which people would bootleg or import or otherwise get alcohol into the country and selling territories. The profitability of smuggling and capitalizing on Prohibition spurred the growth of organized crime, and that was something that we discussed in depth in our classroom. Look, we're already halfway through, moving on to some short answer and fill in the blank. And I always advise students, if you get stuck, you see a blank line, never leave it blank, always take a guess, but also have a conversation with yourself in your mind. What were we talking about when this question came up? What other things were going on around me? If I was drifting off into the land of chocolate, what was the last thing I remember? Try to have that conversation with your brain. You might bring it to the forefront. Name 2 inventions that made life easier in the home. Improving quality of life or save time. So you might say the car, but inside the house, you might say the blow dryer, the refrigerator, the lazy boy, electricity, and any kind of kitchen appliance that you might also list there would be good. So even think for that question, what do I use modernized now that might have come from that era? There's many ways to approach your own thinking that can help you spike a statement to put down for an answer. What was the crossover argument for Prohibition that explained how it might help the war effort? That you could use the barley instead of making beer and bake bread for the troops. That way we combine 2 efforts and movements into one. A grassroots organization, what is it? There were many during this time, including women's suffrage headed into this unit and many other grassroots organizations from muckrakers to other ways of society's improvements. A grassroots organization is one that comes from the people to other people, side to side, by talking, by educating the public, by speaking out in a one-to-one or group level and not from the top down. Carrie Chapman Catt talked about how decisions are made and what was the solution. Carrie Chapman Catt was not a name that was familiar to my class before we started, but she was a leader in the women's suffrage movement and said that men are making decisions that affect us behind closed doors. The only ways for us to disrupt that and to become part of this system is to vote and then to get behind those closed doors where those meetings are taking place. Moving along, what are 2 inventions pushing popular culture and shared media experiences during the 20s? You might say magazines, you might say movies, radio, music, dance. That's 5. Just list down 2. And hopefully that kind of knowledge, even if you're not in my class, will help you perform on your exam as well. What are 2 reasons that Prohibition failed in the United States? 1, it wasn't that popular to begin with. 2, there wasn't enough enforcement. 3, there wasn't enough money going into fighting it. 4, there were a wealth of people able to make a ton of money smuggling. 5, speakeasies circumvented. And 6, people were importing and smuggling in other ways, not just bootlegging. So there were many, I guess you'd say, holes in the alcoholic bucket that were still pouring out and getting people their alcohol. So with the money spent and without the public support, it was going to be different and difficult to pass. And then one of the final questions today, the Harlem Renaissance, is something that we talked about in class. We read poetry, we looked at big cities, and it's the great migration of minorities moving north to big cities. In 1920, there were 5 million of the nation's 12 million who were in cities, and that was a big change from the decade prior. And it established a lot of neighborhoods that would become significant and still today are culturally significant in different populations, and set the course for how big city history would also play forward in the future. And finally, in 1927, the first transatlantic flight from New York City to Paris. Again, we have flights now. The foreboding or the prediction that airlines become more important in our future, completed by Charles Lindbergh in the spirit of St. Louis. And that's it. We boiled down the Roaring 20s into about 27 questions in less than 9 minutes, so quite a rapid review. If you have more questions, leave them down in the comment section. We'll pin you if it's the best comment. That's your homework assignment. And for my students, make sure you study, recap, look over your notes, make sure your 3-2-1s are up to date at the end of each lesson. And for anyone who's watching who's not in my classroom, don't forget to follow us on Twitter at Hauger History or Danny Hauger, and subscribe to the new show, Inspiring Teachers. Thank you so much for listening. This is Mr. Hauger, also offering free music every single week. Hope you're having a fantastic time wherever you're listening from. And for now, class is dismissed. We will see you later, and thank you so much for tuning in to the Hauger History Podcast.